The first thing you noticed about table 15 at the Plaza Hotel wasn't the lack of a floral centerpiece, or the fact that the tablecloth had a faint, stubborn coffee stain near the edge that the staff had tried to hide by placing the salt shaker over it. No, the first thing you noticed was the draft. It was the overflow table, the one they added at the last minute for the guests they couldn't quite uninvite but didn't really want. It was tucked conveniently next to the swinging kitchen doors, where the air was a chaotic mix of expensive perfume from the ballroom and the smell of dishwater and panic from the back of the house. Every time a waiter rushed past with a tray of filet mignon steaks that I suspected cost more per plate than I spent on groceries for an entire month, the doors would swing open, and a gust of cold air would hit my bare shoulders. I shivered, clutching a glass of lukewarm water because the champagne flutes hadn't made it this far back. I sat there, invisible, watching the crystal chandeliers cast prisms of light across a room that smelled of old money, new arrogance, and the kind of happiness that felt like a foreign language to me. My sister's wedding was a fairy tale. It was a masterpiece of white lace, imported orchids, and 23-year-old optimism. From my vantage point in the shadows, however, it felt more like a spectator sport I hadn't bought a ticket for. I looked down at my dress. It was a navy blue chiffon number I'd bought 2 years ago for a hospital fundraiser. Back then, I thought it was elegant. Tonight, surrounded by designer silk and custom-tailored tuxedos, it looked exactly like what it was. A cheap attempt at dignity. I unconsciously ran my thumb over the hem on my knee. Last night, under the dim light of my kitchen table, I had tried to restitch a tear with thread that I thought matched. In the harsh light of the plaza, the thread looked glaringly purple against the blue. It was a small detail, a tiny imperfection, but to me, it felt like a neon sign screaming fraud. My phone buzzed in my clutch, a harsh vibration against my palm. I checked it under the table, shielding the screen's glow like a secret. It was a text from Mrs. Gable, the babysitter. Just a reminder that her hourly rate went up after midnight. I did the mental math instantly, a habit that had become as natural as breathing. If I stayed for the cake cutting, that was another $20. $20 was a week of school lunches for Mia. $20 was the difference between paying the electric bill on time and getting another final notice. I put the phone away, a lump forming in my throat. Mia had cried when I left. She wanted to come. She wanted to see the princess wedding. She had begged to wear her thrift store velvet dress and dance with me. But I knew better. I knew that weddings like this weren't safe places for little girls with worn-out shoes, and no father to hoist them onto his shoulders to see the bride. I had left her at home to protect her from the stares, from the whispers, from the pity. But sitting here alone, listening to the band play a love song that made my chest ache, I felt a wave of guilt so potent it nearly choked me. Was I protecting her? Or was I just ashamed of us? Then, the air in the room seemed to shift. Like a shark scenting blood in the water, my ex-husband Caleb detached himself from a group of laughing men near the bar. He wasn't alone. Clinging to his arm, looking radiant and undeniably, heavily pregnant, was my cousin Vanessa. His new wife, the woman he had married exactly 6 months and 2 days after walking out on me. The woman who was currently carrying the second chance he had claimed he wasn't ready for when I was the one pregnant with Mia. They approached my table with the casual, languid cruelty of people who knew they held all the cards. I stiffened, my fingers gripping the stem of my water glass so hard I feared it might snap. I remember the way Caleb looked at me. He didn't sneer. That would have been too honest. A sneer I could have handled. Instead, he wore a mask of polite, pitying concern that was infinitely worse. He scanned me from head to toe, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second on that restitched hem, and I could hear his thoughts as clearly as if he'd spoken them through a megaphone. He was thinking that I looked tired. He was thinking that I looked like a woman who was drowning, and he was the one standing on the shore, dry and warm. He leaned in, his cologne a scent I used to love, now smelling like betrayal and expensive lies overwhelming the scent of the lilies. He asked me how I was coping. He didn't use the words poor or pathetic, but they hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. He asked if I was still working those brutal double shifts at the hospital, framing it as admiration for my stamina. But we both knew it was a dig at my necessity. He was reminding me that while his wife rested, I worked. While his wife was pampered, I scrubbed. Then, with a casual glance around my empty table, the only table in the room with empty chairs, he delivered the final blow. He wondered aloud, with a tone of fake sympathy that made my skin crawl, why I hadn't brought anyone with me. "It's a shame, Elena," he said, his voice smooth. "You shouldn't have to celebrate alone." Again, as if he didn't know. As if he didn't know that between 12-hour shifts at the pediatric ward and raising the daughter he abandoned, I barely had time to sleep, let alone date. As if he didn't know that the reason I was alone was that the only man I had ever trusted had shattered my ability to trust anyone else. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up, throw my lukewarm water in his face, and demand the $43,000 in child support he owed us. I wanted to tell him that his stamina compliment wouldn't pay my rent. But I didn't. I just sat there, frozen, forcing a smile that felt like shards of glass in my mouth. I let him enjoy his victory because I couldn't afford to make a scene at my sister's wedding. I nodded, mumbled something about being busy, and watched him pat my shoulder, a condescending, dismissive touch before walking away to rejoin the winner's circle. The music swelled. Laughter erupted from the center of the room as the bride and groom began their first dance. I felt the tears pricking my eyes, hot and humiliating. I couldn't do this. I couldn't watch them be happy while I suffocated in the corner. I grabbed my clutch, ready to run. I would leave. I would go home to my drafty apartment, hug my sleeping daughter, and never set foot in this world again. But I never made it to the door. Because as I turned, I felt a weight on me. A gaze so heavy, so physical, it felt like a touch against the back of my neck. I froze. Slowly, instinctively, I looked toward the darkened corner of the bar, and that was when I saw him. He was standing alone, nursing a tumbler of dark amber liquid, wearing a black bespoke suit that fit him like a second skin. He wasn't looking at the bride. He wasn't looking at the dancers. He wasn't looking at the commotion. He was looking straight at me. His eyes were the color of burnt whiskey, dark and dangerous. There was a thin, pale scar cutting across his jawline that whispered of violence in a room built for celebration. He didn't look like a guest. He looked like a predator who had just decided on his prey. He looked like a storm cloud in a room full of sunshine. And for the first time that night, my heart didn't hammer with the fear of judgment. It hammered with something else entirely. Something ancient. Something was warning me to run, and simultaneously daring me to stay. He moved toward me. He didn't walk. He prowled. There was a fluid, lethal grace to his movement that made him stand out from the other men in the room. The bankers and lawyers walked with the arrogance of money, but this man walked with the arrogance of power. The crowd seemed to part for him instinctively, a subconscious recognition of a threat that rippled through the room like a cold current. As he got closer, the sensory details of him overwhelmed me. I smelled him before he even spoke, an intoxicating mix of cedarwood, expensive tobacco, and the metallic tang of a thunderstorm about to break. It was the scent of a man who didn't apologize for his existence. Dante Moretti. I didn't know his name then. I only knew that every alarm bell in my head, the ones honed by years of surviving in a tough city, was ringing. "Run," they screamed. "This is not a safe man." But I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the cheap carpet of the overflow section. He stopped inches from me, invading my personal space in a way that should have been offensive. In any other context, I would have stepped back. But here, with the ghost of Caleb's mockery still stinging my skin, his proximity felt strangely sheltering, like a wall had just been erected between me and the rest of the world. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He didn't ask if the seat was taken. He simply looked down at me, his amber eyes stripping away my defenses layer by layer. I felt naked under his gaze. He wasn't looking at my dress or the bad stitching. He was looking at me. He saw the poverty I tried to hide. He saw the exhaustion etched around my eyes. He saw the humiliation I was trying so desperately to swallow. He spoke, and his voice was a low rumble that vibrated in my chest, deeper than the bass from the band. "You look like you are planning a murder," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, or perhaps an escape. I blinked, startled by his bluntness. My voice cracked, and I hated it. I cleared my throat and tried to summon some shred of dignity. "I was just leaving." "Leaving would be a mistake," he murmured. He took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving mine. "Leaving implies they won. Leaving means you go home and cry over a man who isn't worth the mascara you're wearing." My breath hitched. He nodded slightly toward the dance floor, where Caleb was laughing loudly with his friends, one hand resting possessively on Vanessa's stomach. "I saw him," the stranger said. "I saw what he did. I saw the way he looked at you, like you were nothing." His jaw tightened, the scar on his chin gleaming under the chandelier light. I detest men who punch down. It shows a lack of character. "Who are you?" I whispered. "Someone who has a proposition for you." He set his glass down on my table. The sound was sharp, decisive. "My family is persistent. They are currently circulating the room. trying to introduce me to every eligible heiress and daughter of a senator in New York. They want me to settle down, to marry for alliance. I want them to stop. He leaned closer, and the heat radiating from him was dizzying. And you, he continued, his voice dropping to a velvet whisper that sent shivers down my spine. You need to show that ex-husband of yours that you are not the broken thing he thinks you are. You need to show him that you are not alone, that you are not pitied, that you are not forgotten. He extended a hand. It was large, the knuckles slightly rough, a ring with a black stone on his pinky finger. Dance with me, he commanded. It wasn't a request. Pretend, just for the next few hours, that you belong to me. Let me put my hand on your waist. Let me look at you the way a man looks at the woman he intends to keep. Play the part of Mrs. Moretti for the evening. That's insane, I breathed. I don't even know you. You don't need to know me. You just need to know that I can make him hurt without ever throwing a punch. His lips quirked into a dark, dangerous smile. Look at him, Elena. Look at his smug face. Don't you want to wipe it off? I looked at Caleb, laughing as if he hadn't destroyed my credit score and broken my heart. I looked at the pitying glances of my relatives, and a fire ignited in my belly. It burned through the fear. It burned through the shame. I was tired of being the victim. I was tired of being the invisible, pitiable Elena Vance. I looked back at the stranger, at Dante. One dance, I said, my voice trembling but audible. That's it. We'll see, he replied. I placed my hand in his. The moment our skin touched, a shockwave went through me. His grip was firm, possessive, scorching through the thin chiffon of my dress. He didn't pull me gently. He claimed me. He led me to the dance floor, not asking for permission from the crowd, but parting it. As we stepped onto the marble floor, I felt the entire room shift. It was palpable. Conversations faltered, heads turned. I saw my mother's jaw drop mid-sip of her wine. I saw my sister stop mid-sentence. And most satisfyingly of all, I saw Caleb. He froze. His glass stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes widened, darting from me to the towering, imposing figure of Dante Moretti. I saw confusion, then shock, and finally, a deep, gnawing jealousy. We moved together in a slow, rhythmic sway. Dante didn't dance like the other men, stiff and formal, counting steps. He moved with a primal confidence, pulling me flush against his hard chest, forcing me to follow his lead. I had to tilt my head back to look at him. For the next 3 songs, the world narrowed down to the heat of his hand on my back and the smell of cedarwood. He murmured things to me, not sweet nothings, but instructions and observations. Chin up, he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. Look at me, only me. Let them wonder what I'm whispering to you. Let them think I'm telling you secrets that would burn their ears. They're staring, I whispered back, feeling my face flush. Let them stare. You are the most captivating thing in this room, Elena. Not because of that dress, but because you are surviving them. And survival. Survival is beautiful. For those 20 minutes, I wasn't poor. I wasn't the single mom counting pennies. I wasn't lonely. I was the woman in the arms of the most powerful man in the room. I buried my face in his shoulder, inhaling his scent, allowing myself the forbidden luxury of feeling protected. I felt safe. For the first time in 5 years, I felt utterly, completely safe. When the music finally stopped, he didn't just walk away. He didn't bow and leave me there. He kept his arm draped heavily across my shoulders, shielding me from the prying eyes, marking me as his. He escorted me out of the ballroom, past the gaping stares of my cousins, past a pale-faced Caleb who looked like he'd seen a ghost. He led me out into the cool night air of New York City, but instead of hailing a taxi, he raised a hand, and a sleek, black armored SUV pulled up to the curb instantly. A driver got out to open the door. The ride to my apartment was silent, charged with an electric tension that made the air feel thick. I sat pressed against the leather seat, my mind reeling. Who was this man? Why had he helped me? When we arrived at my crumbling building in Queens, the contrast between his luxury vehicle and my reality was stark. The streetlights were broken. Trash was piled on the curb. This was my world. I expected him to leave then, to drive off back to his penthouse and forget the charity case he'd picked up. Instead, he walked me to the lobby door. He stood there, looking out of place in his bespoke suit against the peeling paint of my entryway. He reached into his pocket and handed me a heavy black card. It had no company logo, no address, Just a name, Dante Moretti, and a number embossed in silver. "The performance is over," he said, his voice grave. "But the offer stands." "What offer?" I asked, clutching the card. "A woman raising a child alone in this city. She needs a monster to keep the other monsters away." His eyes bored into mine. "If you ever need a monster, Elena, call me." I watched his taillights fade into the rainy night, clutching that card like a lifeline I was too afraid to pull. I told myself I would never call him. I told myself that Dante Moretti was trouble I couldn't afford. But as I climbed the 4 flights of stairs to my empty apartment, I couldn't shake the phantom sensation of his hand on my back, holding me up when I was ready to fall. I didn't know it then. But I wasn't just walking back to my apartment. I was walking into the eye of a storm, and the card in my hand was the only thing that would keep me from drowning. The magic of the Plaza Hotel didn't last. It evaporated the moment I clocked in for my next shift at the hospital, replaced by the smell of antiseptic and the beep of heart monitors. Reality has a way of crashing down when you least expect it, stripping away the fantasy until you are just Elena Vance again, the nurse with the student loans, the single mother with the empty fridge, the woman who had danced with a devil and survived. For 3 days, I tried to convince myself that Dante Moretti was a hallucination, a fever dream induced by exhaustion and desperation. I put his black card at the bottom of my jewelry box, buried under cheap earrings, telling myself I would never touch it. I was a good person. I followed the rules. Good people didn't call men who looked like they owned the night. But the universe, or perhaps my ex-husband, had other plans. It started on a Tuesday afternoon. I was updating charts at the nurse's station when Caleb appeared. He shouldn't have been there. He hated hospitals. He said they smelled like death. But there he was, standing in the hallway, looking pale and erratic. He cornered me near the vending machines. He didn't have his usual swagger. He looked terrified. He started rambling, his voice low and frantic. He told me he had asked around. He told me he had made calls to people who knew people. He asked me if I knew who I had been dancing with. He hissed the name Moretti like it was a curse. He told me that Dante wasn't just a businessman. He was the head of a family that controlled half the unions in the city. He warned me, with a desperation that chilled me more than his cruelty ever had, that I was playing with fire that would burn us all down. He said I was an unfit mother for letting a criminal near his daughter. I told him to leave. I told him he lost the right to worry about Mia's safety when he walked out on us. But as I watched him retreat down the corridor, looking over his shoulder, a cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. Caleb was a coward, yes, but he wasn't a liar about his own fear. I went home that night with a sense of foreboding clinging to me like a second skin. The apartment was cold. The radiator rattled, fighting a losing battle against the November wind. I locked the door all 3 locks and checked them twice. 10:15. That was the time my life split into before and after. I had just put Mia to bed. She was clutching her worn-out teddy bear, dreaming innocent dreams about playgrounds and ice cream. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills, trying to decide if I could stretch the grocery budget for 2 more days. Then came the knock. It wasn't the tentative tap of a neighbor borrowing sugar. It wasn't the delivery guy. It was a heavy, authoritative pounding that rattled the frame of the door, dust falling from the cracks in the plaster. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I crept to the door, my socks sliding on the linoleum, and looked through the peephole. The blood turned to ice in my veins. 2 men stood in the hallway. They were huge, filling the space with an imposing, violent bulk. They wore leather jackets that looked expensive and cruel. One of them had a tattoo of a spider web creeping up his neck, disappearing into his hairline. They didn't look like police. They didn't look like anyone who belonged in a walk-up in Queens. One of them held up a phone to the peephole. The screen glowed in the dim hallway light. It was a photo, grainy, zoomed in, but unmistakable. It was me. I was in my blue dress, my head thrown back laughing, Dante's hand possessively on my waist. A photo from the wedding. They shouted through the door. Their voices were thick with a Russian accent, heavy and guttural. They didn't ask me to open up. They told me. They said that Mr. Nikolai wanted to send a message to the Italian. They said that if I were Dante Moretti's whore, I needed to answer for him. They laughed, a sound that promised pain, and kicked the bottom of the door. The wood splintered. Panic, sheer and blinding, seized me. They thought I was his mistress. They thought I mattered to him. They didn't know it was a fake date. They didn't know I was nobody. Or maybe they didn't care. To them, I was just a soft target, a way to hurt a powerful man. I ran to the kitchen. I grabbed a knife, my bread knife, dull and useless, and my hand shook so hard I nearly dropped it. The pounding got louder. The wood groaned. They were going to break it down. I had one choice. One desperate, terrifying choice. I ran to the bedroom, dug the black card out of the jewelry box, and dialed the number with trembling fingers. He answered on the first ring. There was no hello, no polite greeting, just a sharp, alert silence. "Dante," I whispered, my voice cracking into a sob. "Elena." His voice changed instantly. It went from neutral to razor sharp. "What is it?" "There are men," I choked out. "At my door. 2 of them. They're Russian. They have a photo. A photo of us from the wedding. They said they want to send a message." I heard a sound on the other end, the sound of a chair scraping back violently, glass shattering. "Are they inside?" he demanded. His voice was no longer smooth velvet. It was the bark of a general commanding a war. "No, not yet. They're kicking the door." "Listen to me," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for panic. "Take Mia. Go to the bathroom. Lock the door. Get in the tub. Do not make a sound. Do not come out until you hear my voice. Do you understand?" "Dante, please." "I am coming, Elena. Stay on the line. Do not hang up." I did exactly as he said. I scooped a sleeping, confused Mia out of her bed. She whimpered, asking why we were playing hide-and-seek at night. I whispered lies into her hair, telling her it was a game, a special, quiet game. I locked us in the tiny bathroom, climbed into the porcelain tub, and pulled the shower curtain closed. I huddled there, clutching my daughter to my chest, listening to the terrifying sounds from the living room. The front door gave way with a sickening crack. Heavy boots stomped on my floorboards. I heard them tearing through my apartment, smashing lamps, overturning furniture. I heard them calling my name, their voices taunting, hunting. "Come out, little nurse," one of them shouted. "We just want to talk." I pressed the phone to my ear, tears streaming down my face silently. "Dante," I breathed. "They're inside." "I'm at the corner," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. 30 seconds. Those 30 seconds were a lifetime. I counted every heartbeat. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. Then, the noise outside changed. I heard the screech of tires outside the window. I heard shouts not in Russian, but in Italian. I heard the front door burst open again, followed by the deafening, chaotic sounds of violence. Bodies hitting walls, grunts of pain, and then, silence. "Elena?" Dante's voice came through the phone, but also through the door. "Open it." "It's me." I climbed out of the tub, my legs shaking so bad I could barely stand. I unlocked the bathroom door. The hallway was a wreck. My lamp lay shattered. My photos were on the floor. But standing in the center of the chaos was Dante Moretti. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a chest heaving with exertion. He held a gun in one hand, pointed at the floor. Behind him, 2 of his men, grim-faced giants, were dragging the unconscious bodies of the Russians toward the exit. Dante stepped in front of me, blocking my view of the violence. He didn't say a word. He holstered his weapon and reached out. He didn't ask if I was okay. He looked at me, saw the terror in my eyes, and made a decision. He scooped Mia out of my arms, holding her against his shoulder as easily as if she weighed nothing. He grabbed my hand with his free one. "We are leaving," he said. "Now. My clothes. My things." I stammered, looking at the ruin of my life. "Leave it," he said. "You don't need it. You have me." We ran. We ran down the stairs, out into the rainy night, and into the back of his waiting convoy. As I sat on the leather seat, watching my building disappear in the rearview mirror, I realized the truth. I wasn't just a fake date anymore. I had been pulled into the orbit of a black hole, and there was no escaping the gravity of Dante Moretti. Waking up in Dante's penthouse was like waking up on a different planet. My old apartment smelled of damp plaster and cooking onions from the neighbors. This place smelled of expensive coffee, fresh linen, and silence. The silence was the loudest part. It wasn't the scary silence of loneliness. It was the insulated silence of wealth. I opened my eyes and stared at a ceiling that was impossibly high. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, revealing a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline that people usually only saw in movies. I sat up, panic flaring for a brief second as I remembered the shattered door and the Russian voices. But then the softness of the duvet registered. I was safe. We were safe. I slipped out of bed, checking on Mia. She was sleeping soundly in the massive guest bed next to mine, looking like a tiny doll in a sea of white pillows. I left her to sleep and walked out into the main living area, following the smell of coffee. I expected Dante to be gone. I expected him to be out running his empire, doing whatever dangerous men did in the morning. Or if he was here, I expected him to be cold, distant, regretting the fact that he had brought a stray cat and her kitten into his fortress. I was wrong. I walked into the kitchen and stopped dead in my tracks. It was a sleek, modern space of marble and stainless steel, but the scene taking place in it was disarmingly domestic. Dante was standing on the island. He wasn't wearing the intimidating black suit of the wedding, nor the blood-splattered shirt from last night. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a black t-shirt that stretched tight across his back. His arms were exposed, revealing intricate tattoos of vines and Latin script winding around muscles that shifted as he moved. He was holding a whisk, and sitting on the counter, swinging her legs and wearing her oversized pajamas, was Mia. She was awake, and she was laughing. "Do you want the ears to be big or small?" Dante asked her, his voice serious, as if they were discussing architectural blueprints. "Big," Mia chirped. "And with chocolate eyes." Big ears, chocolate eyes. Understood. He was making Mickey Mouse pancakes. The man who had pistol-whipped a Russian gangster in my hallway 12 hours ago was currently trying to pour batter into the shape of a rodent, and he was doing it with a level of concentration that was both terrifying and endearing. I stood in the doorway, my heart doing a treacherous, painful flip in my chest. I watched him. I watched the way he moved around the kitchen, efficient, precise, but gentle. I watched the way he handed Mia a napkin before she even asked for one. "Good morning," he said without turning around. He had sensed me. "Good morning," I whispered, walking further into the room. You know how to cook?" He turned then, leaning his hip against the counter. His hair was damp, freshly showered. The bruise on his knuckles was the only evidence of last night. "I am Italian, Elena," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "If I couldn't cook, my grandmother would rise from her grave and haunt me." He slid a plate toward me. "Eat. You look pale." I sat down next to Mia. She was already digging in, syrup dripping down her chin. "Mommy, Mr. Dante says he builds giant houses, like castles." I looked at him over my coffee cup. "Is that what you told her?" "It is the truth," he said, pouring himself a cup of espresso. "I own a construction firm. I build skyscrapers, hotels, foundations." "And the other stuff?" I asked quietly. "The men? The guns?" His expression darkened slightly, but he didn't look away. "That is also the truth. I build protection. Sometimes walls are made of brick, and sometimes they are made of reputation. I maintain both." After breakfast, instead of sending us to a room to hide, he stayed. He pulled out a sketchbook and a set of professional graphite pencils. Mia, emboldened by the pancakes, asked if she could draw with him. I sat on the plush sofa, pretending to read a magazine, but really, I was watching them. I watched this massive, dangerous man sit on the floor next to my 5-year-old daughter. He didn't treat her like a nuisance. He treated her like a student. "Look," he said, guiding her small hand with his large, scarred one. "If the light comes from here, the shadow goes there. See? That gives it depth." "It looks like a real building," Mia gasped. "It will be," Dante said softly. "One day." "Why don't you have a little girl?" Mia asked, with the innocent cruelty of children who don't know boundaries. I held my breath. I expected him to flinch, to close off. Dante stopped drawing. He looked at the paper for a long moment. "Because my world is loud, Piccola, little one, and it is hard to keep beautiful things safe in a loud world. I decided a long time ago that it was better not to have them than to lose them." My heart broke a little at the resignation in his voice. He had condemned himself to loneliness as a penance for his power. "But you're keeping us safe," Mia said simply, coloring in a window. "And we're beautiful." Dante looked up, his eyes meeting mine across the room. The intensity in them stole the air from my lungs. It wasn't the look of a predator anymore. It was the look of a man who had been starving for something he didn't know he needed, and suddenly found a feast in front of him. "Yes," he murmured, his voice rough. "You are." That night, after Mia finally crashed from the sugar rush and the excitement, I couldn't sleep. I found Dante out on the terrace, overlooking the grid of Manhattan lights. The city looked peaceful from up here, reduced to twinkling stars, far removed from the grit of the streets below. "You can't keep us here forever," I said, stepping into the cold air. He didn't turn. He took a drag of a cigarette, the smoke curling into the wind. I can. I have the resources. That's not a life, Dante. That's a prison, even if it is a gilded one. I moved to stand beside him. I have a job. Mia has school. We can't just exist in your tower. If you go back down there, he said, flicking the ash, Nikolai will find you. He thinks you are mine. And because he thinks you are mine, you are a target. So what do we do? He turned to me then. He looked tired. The invincible armor had cracked just a fraction. I fix it. I am meeting Nikolai in 2 days. I will negotiate. I will give him territory, money, whatever he wants to forget he ever saw your face. You'd do that? I asked, shocked. You'd give up territory? For a fake girlfriend? He stepped closer, invading my space again, just like at the wedding. But this time, I didn't want to run. I leaned into it. You think this is still fake, Elena? He whispered, his hand coming up to cut my cheek. His thumb brushed over my lower lip, sending a jolt of electricity straight to my core. I watched you with your daughter today. I watched you fight for her. I haven't felt fake since the moment you stepped into my car. This is dangerous, I breathed, my eyes fluttering shut as his forehead rested against mine. I know, he said. I am a monster, remember? I told you to call a monster. You don't feel like a monster, I confessed, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. You made pancakes. You drew pictures. You saved us. I am both, he said, and that is why you should be terrified. But I wasn't. Standing there in the moonlight, wrapped in the scent of cedar and smoke, I realized a terrifying truth. I had spent my entire adult life looking for a good man, a man who followed the rules, who worked a 9 to 5, who smiled politely, and all that had gotten me was abandonment and poverty. Now, here I was with a man who had blood on his hands and a gun in his waistband, and for the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel alone. I felt seen. I felt cherished, and God help me, I felt safe. I realized then that I would rather be in the cage with the lion who protected me than out in the wild with the sheep who would let me be eaten. The bubble of domestic bliss in the penthouse was beautiful, but it was fragile. I knew it had to burst. I just didn't expect the needle to be my own flesh and blood. It happened on a Friday afternoon. Franco, Dante's head of security, a man who looked like he was carved out of granite, walked into the living room. He didn't look at me. He looked straight at Dante and gave a grim nod. They had found the leak. They knew who had told the Russians where I lived. They knew who had told the Russians where I lived. They knew who had sold a photograph of a single mother and a mob boss to the highest bidder. It wasn't a rival gangster. It wasn't a corrupt cop. It was Lucas, my cousin Lucas, the one I had grown up with. The one who had borrowed money from me 1,000 times to pay off debts that he swore were the last ones. The one I had fed when he was broke, even when I was skipping meals myself. He had sold my address, my safety, and my daughter's peace of mind to the Bratva to settle a gambling debt. Dante was going to handle it. He told me to stay in the penthouse with Mia. He told me he was going to a meeting at the docks to negotiate a final truce with Nikolai, the Russian boss, and he planned to deal with Lucas. But as I watched him load a fresh clip into his handgun, a cold resolve settled over me. This wasn't just Dante's war anymore. This was my family. This was my mess. I stood up. I told Dante I was coming with him. He refused. He argued. He roared. He told me the docks were no place for a pediatric nurse, but I looked him in the eye and told him that Lucas was my blood, and if anyone was going to look him in the eye while he faced the consequences of his betrayal, it was going to be me. Dante looked at me for a long, tense minute. He saw the fire in my eyes, the same fire he had recognized at the wedding. He nodded once, handed me a bulletproof vest, and told me to stay behind him. The warehouse sat on the edge of the East River, a skeletal structure of corrugated metal and broken glass. It smelled of rust, sea salt, and old fear. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, creating a mournful whistling sound that set my teeth on edge. Nikolai sat at a folding table in the center of the vast, empty space, flanked by 4 armed guards who looked at us with dead eyes. And there, on his knees in the dirt, was Lucas. He was beaten, weeping, his face a mask of snot and blood. When he saw me, he didn't apologize. He flinched. The negotiation started badly. Nikolai sneered at Dante, mocking him for bringing a woman to a war council. He spoke with the arrogance of a man who thought he held all the leverage. He demanded 3 city blocks of Dante's territory in the financial district in exchange for my safety. He pointed a gun casually at Lucas's head and laughed, calling me a pretty distraction and my daughter a future liability. That was the mistake. He mentioned Mia. Something snapped inside me. It wasn't bravery. It was pure, blind, maternal fury. It was the instinct that made a mother lift a car off her trapped child. I stepped out from behind the wall of Dante's back. The room went deadly silent. Even Lucas stopped crying. I walked right up to the table, ignoring the guns trained on my chest, ignoring Franco's hiss of warning. I slammed my hand down on the metal table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. I looked Nikolai in the eye. I didn't plead. I didn't cry. I spoke with a voice that was pure ice, steady and sharp. I asked him if this was what power looked like to him, threatening a 5-year-old girl and a single mother in the middle of the night. I told him that a real king doesn't need to terrorize children to feel big. I told him he looked small. I told him he looked pathetic. I pointed at Lucas, who was cowering in the dirt. I told Nikolai he could keep him. I told him that a traitor was of no value to anyone, that a man who would sell his own family for a roll of dice was poison to any organization. But then I leaned in closer, until I could smell the vodka on Nikolai's breath. I told him that if he ever mentioned my daughter's name again, he would find out that a mother's rage is far deadlier than a hitman's bullet. I told him that Dante Moretti wasn't negotiating for a mistress. He was negotiating for family. And families fight differently. Families burn the world down. Nikolai stared at me. For a long, agonizing minute, nobody breathed. The only sound was the wind and the blood rushing in my ears. I thought I was going to die. I thought he was going to pull the trigger. Then, the Russian threw his head back and laughed, not in mockery, but in surprise. He lowered his gun. He looked at Dante with a strange expression, something close to grudging respect. He told Dante that he finally understood. He said he understood why Dante had chosen me. He said a woman with that much fire was worth a few city blocks. He said he liked me. The truce was signed, not with blood, but with a handshake. We left Lucas there not dead, but banished, stripped of his family name, left to find his own way in the cold. We walked out of there alive. Back in the SUV, the adrenaline crashed. My hands started to shake so violently that I couldn't unbuckle my seatbelt. The reality of what I had done, the guns, the threats, the proximity to death, hit me like a physical blow. Dante didn't say a word. He pulled me into his lap, burying his face in the crook of my neck. He held me tight, his grip bordering on painful, as if he needed to physically verify that I was still whole. Then, he kissed me. It wasn't the chaste, pretend kiss of the wedding. It wasn't a gentle peck. It was a desperate, consuming claim. It was a kiss that tasted of fear and relief and adrenaline. It was a kiss that said, I have you, I see you, and I am never letting you go. I kissed him back with everything I had. In that armored car, speeding away from the docks, the last remnants of fake dissolved. We weren't pretending anymore. We were partners in crime, in survival, and in something that was starting to feel terrifyingly like love. We returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the world had shifted. The colors seemed brighter, the shadows darker. I insisted on going back to work at the hospital. I needed to keep my own identity. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't just a mobster's girlfriend, that I was still Elena Vance, the nurse who saved lives. Dante agreed, but with conditions. Now, there was always a black sedan parked outside the hospital entrance. There was a new orderly named Marco who hovered near my station, a man who looked like he knew more about breaking bones than setting them. I thought the danger was over. I thought the Russians were the climax of the story. But the past has a way of clawing back when you think you've outrun it. Caleb wasn't done with me. His ego, bruised by the wedding and inflamed by my silence, demanded a reckoning. It happened on a rainy Tuesday, 2 weeks after the warehouse incident. I was walking to the parking garage after a grueling 10-hour shift. The garage was dim, the concrete echoing with the sound of dripping water. I was fishing for my keys when Caleb stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. He looked manic. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair disheveled. He blocked my path to the car, his posture aggressive in a way I hadn't seen before. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He started shouting immediately. He told me he knew. He told me he had done his research. He screamed that he knew I was living with Dante Moretti, a known criminal suspect. He told me he was going to call the police. He was going to call Child Protective Services. He was going to call every news outlet in New York. He stepped closer, backing me against the cold metal of my car door. He hissed that I was an unfit mother for exposing Mia to a gangster. He told me he was going to file for full custody. He said he would take her away, and I would never see my daughter again. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced my chest. It wasn't the physical fear I had felt with the Russians. It was worse. It was the primal terror of a mother losing her child to the system. I knew how it looked on paper. A struggling nurse moving in with a mob boss. Caleb could spin a narrative that would destroy me. I opened my mouth to beg, to plead, to promise him anything if he would just leave Mia out of it. But before I could speak, a shadow detached itself from the wall near the elevator. Dante didn't run. He walked with a terrifying, unnatural calmness. He stepped between me and Caleb, his broad back creating a wall of safety. He towered over my ex-husband, radiating a darkness that made the fluorescent lights seem to flicker. Caleb stammered, stumbling back. He started blustering, pointing a shaking finger at Dante, threatening to call the cops right now, threatening to ruin us. Dante didn't hit him. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't shout. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his bespoke suit jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He slapped it against Caleb's chest. The sound was sharp, like a whip crack. "Read it," Dante said. His voice was low, smooth, like a knife sliding through silk. I watched as Caleb opened the envelope, his hands trembling. I watched his eyes scan the documents inside. I saw the color drain from his face, leaving him ashen gray. Dante stepped closer, invading Caleb's space until there was nowhere left to retreat. He began to narrate the contents of the envelope for my benefit. He listed the 5 years of unpaid child support, calculated down to the cent, with interest penalties applied. He stated the figure out loud. $43,214. But he didn't stop there. He listed the dates and times of Caleb's secret trips to Atlantic City during the months he claimed he couldn't afford diapers. He listed the hotel receipts. And then, the final blow. He listed the forensic accounting evidence of embezzlement from Caleb's current employer money Caleb had been skimming to pay for his new wife's lifestyle. Dante leaned in, his voice a whisper that echoed in the concrete silence of the garage. He gave Caleb a choice, a simple, binary choice. He told Caleb that he could wire the full $43,000 to Elena's account by 9 a.m. tomorrow and leave the state of New York forever. Or, Dante would hand that envelope to the FBI, to the IRS, and to Caleb's boss. He asked Caleb if he thought a judge would grant custody to a man facing 15 years in federal prison for fraud and tax evasion. He told Caleb that if he ever tried to contact Mia or me again, the police would be the least of his worries. He told him that some debts are paid with money, and some are paid with blood, and he was indifferent as to which currency Caleb chose. Caleb looked at me. Then he looked at Dante. He looked at the envelope shaking in his hands, realizing that his life as he knew it was over. He didn't say a word. He didn't fight. He turned and ran. He ran to his car, tires screeching as he fled the garage like the coward he always was. I watched him go, feeling a physical weight lift off my shoulders, a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying for 5 years. The monster under my bed was gone. Dante turned to me. His expression was unreadable, his eyes searching mine, waiting to see if I was repulsed by his method, by his blackmail. I wasn't. I looked at this man who had weaponized his power to destroy the person who had tormented me. I walked up to him and wrapped my arms around his waist, burying my face in his chest. "Thank you," I whispered. "Justice," he murmured into my hair, "is best served cold and expensive." 3 weeks later, the leaves in Central Park had turned to gold, signaling the arrival of a biting winter. But inside Il Fiore, Dante's flagship restaurant in Manhattan, it was warm. Dante had told me he was hosting a business dinner. He said it was important for his legitimate partners to see him settled. He asked me to wear a dress, not the blue chiffon from the wedding, but a new one he had bought for me. It was emerald green velvet, fitting every curve, making me feel like a queen. When we arrived, the restaurant was closed to the public. But it wasn't empty. I walked through the double doors and stopped. Sitting at a long table in the center of the room, adorned with hundreds of white roses and flickering candles, was my family. My parents were there. My sister, the bride from the wedding, was there. Even my colleagues from the hospital were seated, sipping vintage wine. The atmosphere was completely different from that night at the plaza. My mother didn't look at me with disappointment or pity. She looked at me with awe. My father stood up and shook Dante's hand with genuine respect, a deference I had never seen him show anyone. They knew he was dangerous. Yes, the rumors had spread, but they also knew he had done what they never could. He had saved me. He had erased my debts, protected my child, and silenced my abuser. We took our seats. Dante sat at the head of the table, and he placed me at his right hand. not hidden in the overflow section, not near the kitchen doors. At the place of honor, dinner was exquisite, a blur of laughter and courses that tasted like heaven. But I could feel a hum of anticipation in the air, a secret vibration that everyone seemed to be in on except me. When dessert arrived, a dark chocolate soufflé dusted with gold, Dante stood up. The room went instantly silent. The waiters stepped back into the shadows. He looked down at me, and for the first time since I met him, I saw nervousness in the eyes of the man who had stared down Russian mobsters and blackmailed bullies. He cleared his throat. He didn't make a speech about business. He didn't talk about construction or territories. He spoke about the night we met. He talked about the woman in the blue dress sitting at table 15. He talked about seeing a woman who looked like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, but refused to buckle. He confessed that he had only intended to help her carry it for an evening, a simple act of defiance against a rude ex-husband. But somewhere between the dance floor and the drive home, somewhere between the pancakes and the panic rooms, he realized he didn't want to hand the weight back. He wanted to carry it for a lifetime. He looked at me, his amber eyes shining with an emotion that was raw and terrifyingly open. "I have built many things in this city, Elena," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "I have built towers that scrape the sky. I have built walls to keep enemies out. But until I met you, I never realized I hadn't built a home." Then he looked down at the end of the table. "Mia?" he called out softly. My daughter scrambled out of her chair. She was wearing a new dress, pink and puffy, looking like a little cupcake. She was holding a small velvet box with both hands, marching toward us with solemn determination. "I have the ring, Dante," she announced, her voice ringing clear and proud. "I didn't lose it. Can I be the flower girl now?" Dante laughed, a rich, genuine sound that melted the last of my defenses. He took the box from her and knelt on one knee in front of me. He opened it. Inside wasn't a prop. It wasn't a piece of costume jewelry for a fake wife. It was a diamond that caught the candlelight and threw rainbows across the table. A stone that promised forever. "Elena Vance," he said, "I am not asking you to pretend anymore. I am asking you to be my wife for real. I am asking you to let me be the father Mia deserves. I am asking you to trust me with your heart, promising that I will guard it more fiercely than any of my territories. I cannot promise you a safe life. I cannot promise you a normal life, but I promise you that you will never, ever be alone at a table again." I looked at my family, finally smiling at me with true happiness. I looked at Mia, bouncing on her toes, waiting for me to say yes so she could have her new dad. And I looked at Dante, my protector, my dark knight, the monster who had saved me. Tears streamed down my face, but they weren't the hot, humiliating tears of the wedding. They were cool, sweet tears of joy. "Yes," I whispered. Then louder, "Yes, I will be Mrs. Moretti." He slid the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly. He stood up and pulled me into a kiss that earned a round of applause from the room and a squeal of delight from Mia. Later that night, I stood on the balcony of the restaurant, looking out at the New York skyline. Dante came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. I thought about the girl at table 15, invisible and afraid, counting pennies for a babysitter. She was gone. In her place was a woman who had learned the most important lesson of all. We grow up believing in fairy tales. We are taught to wait for Prince Charming on a white horse, a man who is pure and good and safe. But sometimes, life doesn't send you a prince. Sometimes, the world is too dark for a prince. Sometimes, fate sends you a king in a black armored SUV, a man with scarred hands and a dangerous reputation, a man who is willing to burn down the world just to see you smile. And honestly, standing there in the arms of my husband, with my daughter sleeping safely on a velvet bench inside, I knew the truth. I wouldn't trade my monster for all the princes in the world.